Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we have an episode. It's centered on a submission that I had gotten over a year ago now from a gentleman named Dan Cope about an abandoned, well, not an abandoned, but a derelict hospital that had some really, really strange events that happened while he was there as an officer. But before I get into that, I just want to quickly explain something. Our fans that have been with us for so long, you may have noticed that we did this 20 effed up minutes, this new segment. Well, as it happens, from now on, we're just going to do the podcast and call it however long it takes. It's just the Effed Up Stories podcast. The reason being that it really dawned on me that the submissions really was the heart and focal point of what we wanted to do in the beginning with Effed Up Stories in podcasts. We got on the habit of doing these, carrying out these really topics that are already covered by other places, just because we wanted to get the ball rolling. We didn't have submissions in the beginning, and eventually we kind of lost our way and just kept doing that and trying to fill an hour with whatever we did. And all these great stories that were submitted, there's a lot of them we didn't cover just because we didn't think they would fill an hour. And, that really was the main goal. So we will still cover, different topics and suggestions that you have from time to time. But the focal point that we do want to cover is the stories from you people, our fans, and we really want to promote more submissions. I mean, that is the heart of what Effed Up Stories is. It's your stories that we tell. So tonight we're going to cover the story with Old Booth Hospital. It was sent in by Dan Cope. He's a retired officer. He submitted this. It was well over a year ago, and it really stuck with me. I'd been waiting to get an opportunity really to get this story out there for some time. It was always in the back of my head. So tonight, finally, I will get to tell you people. So this, as I said, it comes from a retired officer. At the time, he was working in Covington, Kentucky. Covington is a suburb of Cincinnati. So now, according to Dan, this happened in the late 1970s. And he said that at the time, there was lots of crime downtown, robberies, shootings, and etc., which led him to having what he called a permanent third shift. He was a young officer. He had this thirst for action, so he volunteered, for the late shift. This is apparently when, crime was at its peak, and he wanted to be part of it. So, as is always the case, the high crime rate put a strain on Dan's department, and the shift supervisors, they had this zero tolerance policy for people who would call in with calls that would waste their time, prank calls or just things that weren't really considered serious. And this all came to a head when they started to get multiple calls per night from these security guards that were, patrolling this old Booth Hospital. And for those of you listening, if you are familiar with the area or have heard of Old Booth Hospital, it's on 2nd Street in Covington, Kentucky. I would love to hear you chime in the comment section. Now, this, of course, it isn't a hospital anymore. It's a condominium build or complex, but it was a hospital, and those of you who are older may remember it. So anyway, as Dan put it, Booth Hospital has a long history, as I guess, any popular hospital would see over the years. It's had its number of people live or be birthed to die. It has 4 full-size floors, and he said on the 5th floor, it was half the width of the other floors. This was the floor that housed the only surgery room. So the competing hospital, St. Elizabeth, was better equipped, and over time, that St. Elizabeth became the primary spot for people to go, and this inevitably led to Booth Hospital closing down. And that's essentially when we get to Dan's part of the story. So at this point in time, Booth Hospital is now closed down. It was actually scheduled for a partial demolition, but it ended up getting saved when a conglomerate purchased it. And their goal was to turn this old hospital into the condominium complex that I mentioned that it is today. It's for wealthy folk who can afford it, right? So anyway, the owners at the time, before it was a condominium complex and was still a kind of a rundown old hospital, they hired a security firm, and they wanted to protect their investment, and these security guards were going to patrol this thing 24/7. And Dan said at night they would walk around with these Coleman lanterns. He believes that the name of the security company was Wackenhut Security, and I believe Ryan has actually done some.
Yeah, we did some background searching, and in fact, that it was a legitimate security company. It's been around since the mid-50s.
Yep. So I mean, Ryan will chime in from time to time to corroborate some of the details of the story. So it wasn't long after the guards took on this job of patrolling Booth Hospital that the main guy doing the nights, he started having these serious issues, and he would start calling the police department on a nightly basis, and he would say he could hear children and others running around upstairs. Now, of course, the police department, they would respond expecting to find intruders. But as always the case with these kinds of things, when they went, they would never see or hear anything, and they would leave. So Dan said within a month, these calls changed from nightly to hourly. His sergeant was going crazy. He was ready to string this guard up. And on this one particular night, Dan's sergeant told him, and I quote, "If that crazy guard calls again tonight, I want you to arrest him, shoot him or something. Just make him stop calling us." So that night, Dan ended up heading on over to Booth Hospital. He said it was around midnight, it was winter, and it was very cold. It wasn't because he got a call from the guard that night, though. Instead, kind of oddly, he got a call from the people who lived across the street from Old Booth Hospital. They had called and said that there was something wrong with the security guard. They told him that they saw the security guard run from the front doors of the hospital, and he was crying and sobbing. And now he was sitting in his car, which was parked in front of the main doors of the hospital. So when Dan arrived, he went over, and sure enough, he found the guard sitting in his car right in front of the hospital. And he went over and he tapped on the window, and gestured for him to roll down the window. But the guard just sat there rocking back and forth with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, sobbing uncontrollably. So Dan tapped again, only this time he taps harder. And the guard jumped as if, he never noticed that he was there. And he rolled down his window just an inch, just enough to speak to him. And he said, and I quote, "I won't go back in there, and you can't make me." And after he said that, he just quickly rolls back up the window and he continues to rock back and forth, sobbing again. So Dan radios his dispatcher and he explains, this guy must have had a nervous breakdown and that they needed to call the security company to send a replacement guard. And a few minutes later, Dan was told that there was another guard on the way, and there was someone also sent to take care of the guy whimpering in his car. So Dan waited for the guard to show up, and once he did show up, he just went about his normal patrol. And 30 minutes later, he gets this call from the replacement guard, and he asks him to come back. So when Dan finally gets back, he says, the new guard said, I know you guys are sick of coming here. I get that. But will you please come inside, sit down, and just listen for a few minutes? So Dan complies. He goes in, and 6 or 7 minutes into it, he starts to hear the sound of someone running across the floor upstairs and giggling. And the guard, he gets all excited, and he jumps up and he shouts. He's like, did you hear that? And Dan replies, he did, but not that he thinks it's a ghost. He says, let's go catch our prankster. So they start walking through the main hallway, and they're just kind of making chit-chat. And they get to the elevator. They're not really thinking about what they're doing. I mean, Dan just thinks it's a prankster anyway. They get to the elevator, and Dan pushes the button. And they step inside. But oddly, when they step inside, they didn't get a chance to push any buttons. Instead, the elevator doors just mysteriously closed almost immediately, and the elevator began to go up. Of course, this startled the both of them, and they just kind of watched the buttons light up one after another as they ascended, eventually reaching the top floor, which, if you remember, is the floor that's only the half of the size of the other floors, and it's the one that has the only surgery room. So they get up to the top, the door opens, and they get out. And Dan said the room was fully lit. And this was an odd point because Dan had actually mentioned earlier in the story that the power lines, or like where all the power lines looked like they were cut off, like as if they were hacked through by an axe. And as he mentioned earlier, the guards were actually walking around with lanterns because there was no power. So this was really weird that they would have lighting and all this stuff, and when they stepped out into the fully lit room, they noticed that it was almost completely vacant. But I say almost because they saw an old woman and a stretcher in the middle of the room, and Dan said she was dressed in a bathrobe and she was standing in the middle, just kind of staring at this wall clock and it just it read 2:13. And which was obviously the wrong time. It was just kind of stuck there. And Dan and the guard were kind of shocked, and they just stood there, really surprised by this. And the woman started to laugh. And then Dan, grounded in reasoning, he just figures she was a patient that got loose from the Garrard Street nursing home, which was about 4 blocks away. Actually, he even called his dispatcher to check, to get them to phone over to that nursing home and see if they were missing a patient. And with that, Dan proceeded into the middle of the room with the intent of taking hold of her. When she suddenly turned, she cackles and runs up to him, poking her cold, wrinkly finger into his chest. She then ran off towards some stairs on a side exit. And, Dan looks to the guard and he says, we better go get her before she gets hurt. So at this point in time, Dan is still figuring that this is a runaway elderly patient. And so Dan goes over after her to the side exit door that the lady had just ran through, and still sticking, with the guard the whole way. And, he opens the door and he starts to step through. But as he put it, he stepped into nothingness. There was no stairs. He just stepped into a gaping hole. And lucky for him, the guard was there, and he grabbed his back and pulled him back in the room. Dan said if it wasn't for the guard doing that, he would have fallen 6 floors into the basement. And this is now where he figures that, the old lady must have fallen into. So they ran back to the elevator, kind of panicked at this point, and they pushed a button to head towards the basement. And Dan radios for an ambulance, as they're going down in the elevator, figuring that this old lady is probably really hurt or dead. And once they get to the bottom, they ran towards the area where the lady would have been, but all they could find was rubble and debris. There was no body anywhere. It's as if she just vanished. So Dan calls in a supervisor and a K-9 unit, and he said they spent like 2 hours searching for her and never found anything. The nursing home also called back to say that they weren't missing anyone. And, later on, Dan and a sergeant were standing outside the building. They had people searching through the building, an army of officers. And Dan and a sergeant standing outside the building. And the sergeant wanted to hear a story again. So, Dan retells his story. And the sergeant shook his head and said, if there's no electricity in this building, and obviously there's not, indicating, the chopped wires at the door, how did the elevator work? And how were the 5th floor lights on? And Dan didn't have an answer. He just went back to the elevator with the guard and his sergeant again, just at a loss for words. And they were all kind of shocked to find that the elevator wouldn't work again. It was as they would expect. There's no power. They picked and they prodded. They couldn't get it to work. And when they went to the stairs, they only went to the 2nd floor. Above that, all the stairs were demolished and destroyed. So then they walked outside and they looked up at the 5th floor. There was no lights. It was just dark. And then they went back in. Dan trying to figure out what he's going to put in his report. He's got an ambulance there, a K-9 unit, all these officers involved searching the building. And as they're looking through the building, they come across this old wooden door with a frosted pane of glass on which was written morgue. They go inside and they find this chest-type freezer. And Dan wondered if maybe, she could be hiding inside this thing. So they open the top, and the seemingly empty freezer, the shelf just collapsed. It's that old, it's just falling apart. The shelf collapses, and below the shelf was the body of an elderly woman that, the hospital had forgotten to take when they moved everything out. Dan said he couldn't figure if it was, he couldn't say it was the same woman that he saw upstairs. The body was all freezer burned and, as he put it, mummified. But they did call the ambulance back to pick up the body so it could be identified and properly buried. After that, the security company got the guards to sit inside a company car outside the building. Instead of doing its rounds inside, they would actually sit in this company car outside the building and just go in to make rounds every hour or so. And, Dan said he doesn't recall ever getting another call, but after they had found the body, all these problems seemed to disappear. There was no more calls, there was no more reports. But he did have a last note on it, and he said that the shirt that he was wearing on the night that he was there, he said it started to wear as though he'd gotten battery acid on it. Like the worn part of the shirt started to look like it had a distinct handprint. He didn't really know what to make of it, but it is strange nonetheless. And he did go on to say, for what it's worth, he certifies that his story is true. He did not embellish his story in any way, and of course, it occurred in the late 1970s. So, what did Dan come across? Was that the body of a, was the body they found, belonging to the woman that they ran into upstairs?
This restless spirit. Yeah, well, it's your quintessential ghost story, isn't it? It has all the hallmarks. Terrified security guard, strange noises in the night. Right down to a creepy old lady in a hospital gown. So it really got me thinking, and I said, geez, I'll go and look and see, and sure enough, there's a Booth Hospital, and if you look, I did grab some pictures of it, but I couldn't get any that weren't that were free for public use.
Yeah,
everything was copywritten. So if you're interested, there are pictures of Booth Hospital in Kentucky. So Also, along with that, I did look into Officer Dan Cope as well. And though I wasn't able to prove that the guy who sent the story was Dan Cope, I did find without a reason of a doubt that there was a police officer by that name in that particular jurisdiction, um, by the name of Dan Cope. So, and of course, I did verify that the security company was a real security company too. So, I mean, there's quite a few circumstantial things, I guess, around the story to kind of prop it up a little bit. So we kind of just have this guy's word to go by, but wow, what a crazy tale. And I got to say, it really did get me when he said, he they walked up to the elevator and pressed the button. And I'm like, wait a minute. Didn't he say at the beginning of the story that the power cables were cut? And I thought for sure this is all baloney. And then of course we got to that part where he's talking to his sergeant. The sergeant points out to him, you can see where the cables come out of the building there. And I'm not sure if it was some major buildings have like a ground feed that comes in, right? Some have them come in through a mast off of the pole.
Well, what I found interesting was that, it had physical properties, right? I mean, you had electricity when there should not be electricity. You had, an elevator working that seemingly closed the doors and moved on its own.
Well, I believe he said there was that even the floors had been demolished.
Yeah.
Right? Like there were no upper floors beyond the second floor. Like there was no way for them to physically get up there.
It almost, especially with the hospital setting, it reminds me of Silent Hill, right? So, I mean, it was it always fascinated me, that story did. And I'll tell you something that's recent that interested me as well, that's relevant here. I got a comment from Dan Cope on our website. I mean, keeping in mind, he sent this in like, it was a year and a half or longer ago. And, he commented on his own story, this story, and he said, he's Dan Cope, and, he doesn't know how the story got there, but, it is true that that's his story. And, I did comment back, because, I got his email, right? Like, and I looked at the email that he used to sign up to on the site. And that one was a Yahoo account, I think, and the one that he submitted was a Hotmail account, but it still had like the, I won't say his email address, but it had like, people have their own kind of weird, letters they put together, like, maybe it's numbers, like your birth date or your whatever, and you'll recognize it as yours, right? Like DDRIT or something like that. Or like for me, I'd have 227 sometimes at the end, February 27th, that's my birthday. Well, he had like his own little distinct string of characters in his email that was both present in his Yahoo and his Hotmail email account. So I think it was him, but he did say that his daughters asked him to get the story or like submit the story or something like that, so that
they asked him to write it down so it wasn't forgotten, I guess.
Yeah, so I don't know if maybe he sent it or maybe his daughters did, pretending to be him or something like that. But nevertheless, it was kind of cool. He pops on and says, he doesn't even recall sending it, but, it is true, right?
And I guess one of the most potent things about the story is the idea that it's not just an apparition. This apparition manifested so strongly that it was able to physically, like he said, he felt her bony fingers on his chest when she ran up and put her hand on his chest. It wasn't there was nothing ghostly about her. He couldn't see through her. But here, the spirit apparently was able to manifest a light and a table and a whole floor with a clock in it.
And even after she disappeared, I mean, they had a canine unit and an army of officers going through the place, and they couldn't find anything, right? I mean, for a vacant, like derelict building, I wouldn't think it would be too hard, to find some.
Especially an old lady who just took a trip down from the 6th floor to the basement floor without the aid of stairs.
Yeah, and I mean, they knew the area where she would have landed, right? I mean, that's where they went, and the whole story is.
The idea of the elevator really gets me, though. I mean,
oh, me too.
If we're talking a spiritual manifestation, that's a lot of spirit juice.
Oh, hell yeah.
There must be a lot of psychic activity or psychic energy crackling around that particular place. Or maybe it was one of those dimensional things, where you walk into a place how it used to be, for whatever. We have stories of all kinds of stuff like that, going back thousands of years, castles that only exist on a certain night under the moonlight, or a bridge that somebody crossed that, and then they look back and the bridge was gone. It's a strange topic.
It is, and
because you got two different people. So it's not like it's hallucination,
Oh, yeah. Well, and like on that same note, I mean, today, this is a condominium complex. So, I know it's going to be a rare coincidence if, someone listening out there is living in those condominiums. But if you are, or somebody that does, and strange things happening there, because let's face it, old places do have a history, and sometimes, some of these hauntings are residual. Definitely, I'd be interested to hear that. Anybody who's actually familiar with Old Booth Hospital or has stories or knows anything about it, I would be interested to hear that as well in the comment section. And, of course, we're going to be doing more of these. We got a ton of submissions, tons of them, over the last couple of years. So, we got a lot of stuff to do for these podcasts, and we're hoping that you guys are going to keep submitting. And actually, for Dan Cope, he has another story as well. I think it's like 600 and something Arlington Drive. It was another story he sent in.
And now that the holidays are over, we should be getting these shows out on a more regular basis here.
Yes, even though I think we did pretty good considering. We're only like a week or something like that since our last one. So, if you guys have an effed up story of your own, picture, video, whatever, we'd like to hear it. You can submit that to us at our official website. That's effedupstories.com, EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. And I'm also going to be putting these little annotations on this video. You can just click it. It'll take you right to the submission form on our website, and you can fill it out, hit submit, and we'll get your story. And who knows, it could end up in one of these podcasts. So with that having been said, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this story from our fellow Dan Cope, and I hope to catch you next time. This is Will Pender signing off.
Good night, everybody.